It's been a long time, Indiana.
There haven't been many games that have truly captured the essence of their source material quite like 2024's Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. It's not just that Indy sounds like Indy.
I've had a run-in with the Nazis before, and trust me, it ain't a walk in the park.
The tone, storytelling, humor, and even its cinematography feel like they could be straight out of Steven Spielberg's 1981 set. But it wasn't until recently that I discovered just how deep the team's commitment was to capturing the spirit of those original films. While replaying the game earlier this year, I came across this setting for picture framing, something that I had all but ignored during my first run-through. By default, it's set to widescreen, which displays the game in the standard 16:9 aspect ratio found on most modern screens. However, switching to cinematic changes the presentation entirely, revealing previously hidden sides of the frame to create a Cinemascope perspective in line with that of the films. There's a lot of games that use letterbox framing like this to make a game feel a little bit more like a movie, improve performance, or just to give a visual indicator that you've entered a non-interactive cutscene. But while in most cases this just means cropping the top and bottom of the standard display, I found that the Great Circle was doing exactly the opposite, framing for the cinematic mode first, even though the vast majority of players might not ever even see it that way, because that's how the Indiana Jones movies have always looked. As it turns out, the game is packed with creative choices just like this one, that were designed from the ground up to make it feel like you're playing a long-lost Indiana Jones adventure. I wanted to know more, so I reached out to the development team at MachineGames to ask them exactly how they did it. With help from Bethesda Softworks and the game's cinematographer Kyle Klütz, I was able to get in contact with the Great Circle's game director, Jörg Gustafsson, creative director Axel Torvenius, and cinematics director Markus Söderqvist, all of whom were happy to talk with me about their process, starting from the core ideas that every creative decision they made stemmed from. In a 2024 interview with Xbox Wire, Torvenius said, "The original look and feel of 80s cinema was something we wanted to get right from the very beginning. There was never an interest in reinventing the look or feel of Indiana Jones. The core ambition was always to make sure it really hit home in terms of having a style close to Raiders of the Lost Ark." And in an email to me, Gustafsson wholeheartedly agreed. "We wanted the game to feel like this lost Indiana Jones adventure that you somehow missed out on in the 1980s, he said. Raiders of the Lost Ark was our main inspiration, and the reason we wanted the game's story to be a direct continuation of that movie. To create a blueprint on how to approach the game, the team studied a vast array of behind-the-scenes materials, from making-of documentaries to interviews with the film's cinematographer, Doug Slocombe. Söderqvist, Torvenius, and Lucasfilm Games executive producer Craig Derrick studied the original films to catalog Spielberg's style when it came to lighting, technical details, and other crucial elements, such as how he framed establishing shots, close-ups, chase scenes, and so on. This level of attentiveness even extended to tiny details that fans of the film might not even think of, such as getting the interior of Indy's satchel right. I have one of the exact same models at home that I use as a camera bag all the time, and it delights me every single time I open the inventory screen to see all the little pockets and bits of stitching exactly where they should be. Whether the bag can hold a revolver, box camera, bandages, multiple changes of clothes, 3 apples and half a dozen loaves of bread is another matter, but I appreciate the attention to detail nonetheless. But even with all this research, putting it into practice would be no easy feat. However, the team found their North Star early on with the very first thing they put together for the game, a playable recreation of Raiders' iconic opening. This opening sequence was not just an homage to the game's biggest inspiration, it was where the team developed their benchmarks, both of the game's overarching tone and style, and of the level of quality they had to live up to.
You said he was very good!
It was. Just not good enough.
This beginning of the game, recreating scenes from the movie, also came with a lot of pressure, Gustafsson explained. This is why we decided to, for the first time, use a professional director of photography for the game. And with our VO director Tom Keegan's help, we managed to find Kyle. Kyle Klütz, a cinematographer who has worked on the camera departments of a ton of games, quickly became an essential part of what made the Great Circle's cinematics work so well, especially given how much MachineGames was departing from their standard mode of operation. In game development, motion capture sets are used to build a digital model of an actor's movements to translate them into in-game animations. However, despite the number of cameras you'll see on Mocap sets, many productions, including MachineGames' Wolfenstein series, just use these as references, creating their own shots and framing from scratch using a virtual camera to give them maximum flexibility later on. But it quickly became apparent to the team that this approach would not work for the Great Circle. Staging and cinematography were masterfully handled in the original films, so leaving the camera decisions for later wouldn't work, said Marcus Söderqvist. It had to be integrated into the shoot. By using a markered camera system, where actors, objects, and even the main camera can be tracked using tiny marker dots to accurately recreate their movements and position in 3D space, shots could be decided and locked in from the very beginning. This helped ground the cinematography to what could be accomplished on an actual set. A rule I like to follow, Klütz said, was to only plan shots that could be accomplished with technology available at the time when the original films were made. This applied to both filmmaking equipment and how any visual effects would be captured. To pull off these vintage camera setups and to accurately recreate the types of camera moves present in the original films, Klütz brought in a variety of grip equipment, from heavy camera dollies to jibs and Steadicams that would have been available to the filmmakers back then. We always had this idea of how would they shoot this back then, said Söderqvist. Would they have done this shot with VFX and miniature models, or build a real-size set piece? Matte paintings? Bring a crane into the jungle? While digital tools offer limitless possibilities, we intentionally set constraints during pre-production to stay true to the original movies. This process sometimes included planning shots that could take advantage of some of the film's classic lighting and shadow techniques. Some were just there to heighten the drama of the scene. Kyle recounted that MachineGames was particularly enamored of moments where close-ups were elevated with a surgically precise slash of light across the eyes or face, while others played a direct homage to the films themselves. Klütz's team specifically pushed for this shot in the Vatican chapter that references Sean Connery's famous intro in The Last Crusade. When it came to framing, it was also important to the team to keep Slocombe's lens choices in mind. Initially, Kyle tested using actual anamorphic capture, quickly finding that the lenses, which squeeze an image so it can later be stretched in post to create a uniquely wide frame, did not communicate well with the game engine, and had to be nixed. But despite this setback, Kyle cleverly created a more than satisfactory alternative. I looked up the lens kit used on Raiders of the Lost Ark, he said, which were the Panavision C-Series anamorphic lenses, and then did the math to translate their field of view to the ARRI compact zooms we ended up using. We were very strict about adhering to those C-Series focal lengths when capturing our scenes, so that we could better replicate the subject-camera relationship that Spielberg so masterfully choreographed. Of course, the game's Cinemascope framing was calling back to how the original films were shot, but according to Gustafsson, the decision was more than just an aesthetic choice. We wanted to move our games toward a more cohesive interactive experience, he said. Compared to Wolfenstein 2, where our cutscenes were pre-rendered files that played on activation, in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, we moved into a cutscene experience that always runs in real time. This means that we had to move away from, at least as our default mode, our previous setup where gameplay is full screen and cutscenes are in letterbox, which clearly separates the non-interactive from the interactive. Our goal instead was to blur that distinction and make everything feel like a game. Instead of directly matching Raiders' 2.35:1 aspect ratio, the Great Circle went with a very slightly shorter 2.37:1, which perfectly fit into common aspect ratios of ultra-wide gaming monitors, while still rewarding players using the cinematic mode on standard monitors. Torvenius explained that from initial storyboarding and blocking for cutscenes, the team was keeping the different aspect ratios in mind. While MachineGames gave widescreen players the ability to pan the camera around to see the cut-off portions of the frame, it was important to the team that shot compositions in both perspectives remained strong no matter which viewing experience the players chose. Cinematics director Marcus Söderqvist noted that this issue was not unique to them, but in fact was something that the original film cinematographer Doug Slocombe regularly thought about. In an interview with American Cinematographer, Slocombe said, "A consideration with the Raiders pictures and any anamorphic film is the fact that it will be eventually shown on television, and you'll see exactly half the picture. You can try to keep the action in the middle when you're shooting, but on a really complicated action picture, it isn't always possible to do that. But I've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark and Temple of Doom on the box, and I think they work. Of course, you lose a lot of the impact, but in general, I think they hold up quite nicely." Where things became even more complicated was getting the details right, particularly in digitally replicating many of the analog elements and practical effects that were core to the series' cinematic style. The MachineGames VFX team delved into every bit of technical minutia they could get their hands on, determining everything from the characteristics of the film stocks the pictures have been shot on, to developing color grading lookup tables and an authentic feeling grain overlay, to the distinct visual characteristics of the old Panavision C-series lenses used to shoot the original films. There were so many different aspects we looked at, Torvenius said of the process. We tried really hard to mimic to the extent we could, looking at a lot of different post-processing options to emphasize the sensation of being part of a very cinematic Indiana Jones experience. It all comes down to the sum of all small parts. One of these small details that particularly stood out to me was how, when pointing the camera toward a bright light source, the game renders not only the distinctive red oval flares common to the anamorphic C-series lenses, but an accurate simulation of the line of color splotches that come from light flaring against each of the lens's many internal glass elements, even modeling the ways in which these flares churn and distort as the lens passes around and over a light source. It's a lot of work to go into something most people are just going to look over, but Torvenius contended they were absolutely an important part of trying to capture that time and era. Specific attention was also paid to recreating the looks of some of the practical effects used in the original films, from making sure their explosions mimicked the appearance of the classic black powder effects, to imitating the characteristics of cloud tank effects, which movies of the period often used to create the appearance of an intense and billowing storm. But these efforts extended beyond just the visuals of the films. Equally important was getting the game to sound right. The first thing we did was try to identify the core elements of that Indiana Jones sound, the Great Circle's audio director Pete Ward explained in one interview. We sat down as a team and watched all the Indy movies again, and we realized there were several things we absolutely had to get right. Indy's voice likeness,
Stone? What's stone?
the musical score, the whip, the revolver, and the punches. While the team was lucky enough to get a hold of some of the original sound effects from the Lucasfilm vaults, Ward said that despite how close the final audio sounds, none of these original effects were used in the final game. Instead, audio designers and Foley artists used them as references to painstakingly recreate some of the sounds from scratch, as well as develop new ones, allowing the sound work to have the same quality across the board, and to take advantage of the multi-channel Dolby Atmos environment the game was mixed in. As combat in the game, as in the movies, largely revolves around fisticuffs, players would hear Indy's distinct punch hundreds of times throughout a playthrough of the game. So it was important to get it right. Everyone knows that classic Indy punch sound, Ward said. Punching had to feel satisfying and powerful, and achieve that nostalgic, over-the-top sound. Fortunately, there was extensive information on how the Raiders sound team originally brought their sound effects to life, including the punch, which the team was able to follow and iterate on.
We tried a lot of different experiments. We beat on pieces of meat. We broke chicken bones. Probably we had our most success with a pile of leather jackets and a few baseball gloves, making a loose pile of this material and then whacking it with a baseball bat.
Equally important was getting the sound of Indy's whip right. We experimented at first with recording our own whip cracks with a variety of whips, Ward said. It turns out that whip cracking needs quite a lot of space and practice. So we hired and recorded an expert whip maker in Sweden who knew exactly how to get the sounds we were looking for. The music itself went through a similar process as the rest of the sound work, to match the feel of John Williams' classic score, with composer Gordie Howe putting together an orchestra of the same size as Williams in Abbey Road Studios, where the Raiders score was also recorded, even, according to Ward, featuring a couple of session musicians who had played on those original recordings. MachineGames hasn't confirmed as of yet if they'll be coming back to the world of Indiana Jones in the coming years. But according to the team, they'll be bringing along many of the new techniques they learned creating the Great Circle to whatever comes next, particularly when it came to the studio shoot. The combination of shooting cameras on a physical stage is one of the extravagances we had for this project, said Marcus Söderqvist. It was truly great. It's very likely that we'll work with a DP again, Gustafsson agreed, highlighting Kyle's work in helping establish camera angles and the overall visual language of the project. We were just better prepared in every way so that we could have a better idea of what would be seen on screen. At the very least, we're definitely getting one more taste of Indy from the studio. As of this video's release, the new Order of Giants expansion has just dropped, taking Indy deeper into Rome for a whole new adventure. If you haven't played The Great Circle yet, and you're a fan of the original films, or just think any of what I talked about here sounds cool, I highly encourage you to check it out. It really is something special. And maybe, if we're lucky, someday we'll get to put the Indy hat back on.
What if you don't come back?
You'll have one hell of a story to tell.